Now I'm going to go over the long form format known as the Herald. One of my favorites. It's telling a story in 3 acts, but let's get into the explanation. And we're back with the Rainbow Players. So now we're going to learn the Herald. The Herald is going to be a little more complex because it has a definite formula to it. So the Herald has an opening, and the opening, there's several different ways to do the opening. There's the organic opening, there is the group, the rants. There's so many different ways to do the opening, and there's so many there's ways you can research that on the internet. Now, the opening and the group games, when I get to the group games, are typically how Herald teams define themselves from each other, because they'll either have like a format, like we're a mermaid improv team, so our opening is everybody's underwater and they have to open oysters to get the idea, or all the group games have to deal with fish or something like that. Like, so that's really how Herald teams delineate from one another and really have their brand stick out from other teams that are other Herald teams. So you have the opening. Everyone's involved in the opening. Everyone's brainstorming. Now, what's important here is if you get a suggestion from the audience, which is typically what happens, is this is where everyone gets on the same page. This is where everyone's listening to each other's ideas, and this is where you get ideas for the scenes. It also gives you ideas for future scenes of like, oh, I heard that in the opening, so now I'm going to draw this into this scene. I'm going to have this be the important element, or whatever it is. You're also exploring theme in this brainstorming session. What are the greater themes? Is this about life and death? Is this about rebirth? Is this about like strong people having moments of weakness? Like, that's what you're also exploring by exploring the suggestion. Now, the theme becomes really crystallized over the course of the format, but that's part of the brainstorming, is kind of the catalyst for this. So after this, you go into your first scene. To simplify it, we'll just say these are 2-person scenes, but they can be any number of scenes. The whole point is that you have a scene. So in this first scene, you have orange and gray. Okay, orange and gray start a scene, and they do a scene. It goes for a little while, 3 minutes or so. It depends on how long your Herald is, really. But these first scenes are going to be longer and slower because it's very important that you're establishing characters, locations, and relationships. This is the palette by which you're going to paint the whole show with. If your show is a masterpiece painting, this is the palette that you're using, the colors you're going to use to paint that masterpiece. Now, these first scenes tend to also be not only slower, but don't worry about being funny. Be more genuine with these first scenes, because what that's going to establish is a baseline of relatable content for your audience. And it's really, and you're exploring as performers. You're building, you're bringing a brick, so you're building a cathedral. You're building an architectural marvel here. So you're kind of moving slow and exploring with each other. So then, after orange and gray are done, then you have the next scene, and let's say the next scene is pink and green. So pink and green do their scene, and it's a completely different scene. Feel free in this first time to really explore and find these differences. So then the third scene, we'll say it's purple, red, and blue. We'll say it's a 3-person scene, so it's purple, red, and blue. Okay, they do their scene, once again unrelated to the first 2 scenes, and you're really allowing yourself to explore and get really. It benefits you to have different characters, different locations, different things going on. And I'll tell you why in just a second. So that's the first 3 scenes, what we'll call the first act of the show, okay? And this is going to be the longer portion, the slower portion, because you're really establishing all these really important elements of the show, because these are going to come up later. So then you have your group game. Everybody getting here is the common thing. So everyone gets in here, or you can do organic things, or you could do like a dance. Once again, this is where your team, deciding what you do with these group games, is really how you control your brand of the Herald versus another team's brand of the Herald. But the important thing is that everyone's involved, because what this counts as is like a commercial break, or it counts as we're showing the delineation between Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3, okay? So you had your opening, you had your brainstorming session, and then you moved into Act 1, which is 3 scenes, okay? Now you do your group game. Everyone gets in here. It's usually really short, very gimmicky. Sometimes people do the machine or whatever it is. So then now you move on to Act 2. Now you go back to that original first scene, right? And you're doing a couple different things. You're either going forward in time, you're mapping or using a metaphorical scene, or you're exploring a specific character when they're at home, they go to work or whatever. You're really getting deeper with these characters and with these scenes. Now, what you want to start doing in the second act, because you've seen all 3 different scenes, is you want to start blending a little bit the scenes together. Like, whoever was in the first scene may be related to someone in the second scene. So you do the first scene, and they're mentioning stuff, like maybe they're mentioning the same location or something that happened in another scene. Now you go to the second scene. Same thing. The second scene is an exploration. You're going deeper with these characters, either deeper into the story or the relationships are specific about characters. You're going back and forward in time. It doesn't matter. Whatever you think is like a heightening or an evolution of this scene. And again, maybe someone from the first scene walks in and happens to be working at the same place. So you can see these scenes starting to really blend together. Now in Act 2, what the important thing is, you're heightening the games. You're heightening the risk of the world. Like whatever's really important, you're making that really, really big, and you're raising the stakes in the second act. You do the third scene over again, and once again, people might be crossing over, or maybe they're just in the background. You're finding how these scenes are slightly related to each other. That's Act 2. That's why the scene builds, the tension builds in Act 2. Then you do a group game. Another group game where everyone gets in here, everyone's on stage, and you're showing the audience a commercial break. Here is the end of Act 2, right? And the group games are usually pretty short, but a really strong Herald team will make the group games somehow related to the brainstorming session. It's not necessary, but that's typically what a lot of younger Herald teams, as they're learning the Herald, they'll put one person in charge of the group games. Whoever's not in the scenes, that one person's always doing the group games. So if you're learning the Herald and that helps, do that. That's totally fine. So then you come to the third act. And the third act is set up to really bind all the scenes together. Why? So in the beginning, when these three were like, that's why it's good to go like really different scenes and different locations with different characters, because then it's very impressive to the audience as to how do these scenes all really relate to each other in a magnolia of scenes. And I know that sounds really complex, but once you do the Herald a couple times, you see, oh, how I can do that. I can see how these two scenes are related, especially if you subtly started doing it in the second act, in the second beat of Heralds, then it becomes really easy in the third beat of Heralds. Now, here's the difference. In a lot of different Heralds. What they tell you is that the third beat of Heralds is typically that first scene, second scene, third scene, where again, everything's getting heightened and maybe things are getting concluded, or they're just getting absurdly heightened to levels where they're never, ever going to get better. But what happens a lot, a really skillful team kind of throws the three beats out the window, the three scenes out the window to say, okay, in that first scene, we had the color palette. The second scene, we all agreed on what the games or the stakes of the scene were. And now this third act is we can have quick beats. We can have quick scenes. We can have these scenes kind of cut back and forth between each other really fast. We can go forward in time. We can go backwards in time. We can do different mapping sessions. But the important thing is you're not making up new characters and new ideas. You're not doing new scenes. You're, as they say in American improv, you're using all parts of the buffalo. Everything you set up in that first act, now you're showing the importance of it. What's really cool is if you have a character that was like a marginal character in that first act, that all of a sudden becomes really important in the third act. Or maybe there was just a very small element in the first act, a word or a song that was sung, that in the third act ties everything together. So that's the overall form of the Herald. And as you do it, you start getting a good semblance of timing. Like when are we almost done? Like when should we start concluding everything? And that third act, so it also speeds up as things are going on. The first act tends to be slower and longer because you're establishing a lot of things. The second act, we're all deciding like what the conflict or what the game or what the purpose or the heightening of the scenes are, and we're making those bigger so that there's more risks. So we can't wait to see what happens in that third act. And that third act is just melting everything together, concluding some things if you want, or you're making them even more and more absurd. Now throughout this whole time, you've got a suggestion from the audience, and the suggestion could be pencil. And at that brainstorming session, you're starting to explore how people feel about pencils or tell little stories about pencils or whatever. And so as the show's going on, you're also, especially by the second act, you're thinking like, what are the major themes about this show? Meaning that like, is this show about education? And so in that third act, you're really hitting those themes really hard. And look for thought-provoking themes if you can, very heavy themes. And when I say heavy, I'm not saying polarizing. Like, I'm not saying that you should find things where you're making a huge argument to make your audience feel uncomfortable, but you're finding stuff that really has weight. Because for all this improv comedy we're doing, if you have a lot of vulnerability and relationship on stage, then it's really attractive. So that's the Herald. Thank you for watching the IMPROVTOONS. I'm not trying to be like the end-all be-all, the authority on any of these formats. I am trying to provide a resource to people who may not be able to afford having a teacher come on out to their small improv team, or maybe they want to use this to supplement some of their teachings if they are teaching the Herald or teaching the Onion or teaching any of these things in their classes, that they can use this to supplement their teaching. So once again, you can support me. That'd be awesome. Like, comment, and share, but it'd be great to support each other, even if the improv team is not in your country or not in your state. It's really good if we all get to know what's going on out there and support each other, because improv gets better the more we support each other. Bye.